We're in Psalm 18. So if you want to join me there in your Bible, this is an unusual and a wonderful psalm. It's a long psalm, and we're going to cover a pretty good chunk of it today because verses 7 through about 17, David is recounting God's deliverance, and it's very poetic and descriptive. It's all one descriptive account of God's providential intervention. So I'll tell you what, just for the sake of it, so we can get the context, let's begin reading in verse 1. I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. So wonderful worship and confidence, courage that's risen up in David at this point in his life. He says, verse 4, he starts to tell us the story. The sorrows of death compassed me. The floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. So verse 4, you want to track this, the difficulties that he's picturing in verse 4. And it's descriptive and poetic, okay? The sorrows or the ropes or the strongholds, the snares. It's like he's been tied up, bound up, okay, of death and of hell, the grave. The floods of ungodly men. Remember that picture of the floods, okay? So now let me just pause here and say something. There's room for debate on whether David is speaking literally or figuratively, okay? My point is, we would assume the floods of ungodly men to be figurative, but maybe not. Maybe the fact that he's running from Saul drove him into some exile situations that he was threatened and maybe overcome by some floods. Maybe there were some rainstorms that threatened him. Maybe there were some situations that literally encased him, entombed him. Maybe there were situations that were like grave-like experiences. So my point is, maybe there is some figurative ideas here, but maybe they were all born out of some literal experiences, okay? Isn't that the way we talk? We experience something and we say it was like, okay? So there's no doubt in my mind that David is recounting experiences that were like, okay, these things he's describing. And maybe he's using some literary, some poetic, some figurative language to give us, some metaphorical language to give us the strong sense of it. But there's no doubt by the end of verse 5 that David is in big trouble, okay? He says in verse 6, in my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears. Now David says, God heard my cry, and this is what happened. Now verse 7, the first word is then, okay? So what he's going to describe to us is how he was saved from all the things he described in verse 4, okay? And you'll see the parallels because God comes specifically to his rescue. And again, metaphorical, figurative language, maybe. But he's going to describe, in essence, these natural, calamitous, cataclysmic events and ultimately a storm. Now, let's read it and then let's unpack it for a minute. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken because he was wroth. So we have an earthquake. Is it unthinkable that David experienced an earthquake in answer to his prayer? Is it unthinkable that that earthquake somehow turned his enemies back at some critical moment? That's completely possible, okay? That God used an earthquake to deliver David. It's also possible that the deliverance was so cataclysmic that he's saying it was like God moved all of the earth around me to deliver me. Either way, it's the word of God. So I would lean towards taking it literally, that David experienced these literal earthquake-like, storm-like experiences, and that he's attributing them to the hand of God because somehow these events culminated in his ultimate and final deliverance, okay? So, verse 8, there went up smoke out of his nostrils. So are we talking about a volcanic activity? Quite possibly. Are we talking about God literally rising up in anger to avenge David? Of course we are, because that's what happened. So there went up smoke out of his nostrils, fire out of his mouth, devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. So David's now describing a storm, much like if you've ever been in an environment where a thunderstorm rolled in at low altitude, suddenly you feel that darkness enveloping. And so God used these natural events in some way in David's life to bring about deliverance from his enemies and to show his power and his sovereignty and his providence on behalf of David. Verse 10, he rode upon a cherub, and angelic beings flying God to David's side. So he comes in person. He comes in his practical presence. He did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. God stirs up the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. So David is suddenly surrounded by this huge storm, a dark cloud cover, dark water, dark wind. In other words, God is using calamitous circumstances that David might even feel threatened by. Natural events, circumstances in his life that seems like just nature is completely taking over. But in David's case, he was using these events to reveal himself and to deliver David. Now, one of the takeaways, of many, but one of the takeaways to me is that sometimes when life is at its darkest, God's doing his best work. Sometimes when I feel like I'm about to be swept away by events, the actual events that might sweep me away might actually be the providence and intervention of God in my life. These things might be God acting on my behalf. I can look back in my life and see negative events that I thought were going to eat me up and completely destroy me, when in fact, those events delivered me. Those events swept me away from something even more deadly or more dangerous in my life. And that's what David is no doubt describing. So verse 12, at the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones, coals of fire. God is masking his bright presence with darkness, with a storm, with hailstones, with thunder, with wind, with earthquake. Verse 13, the Lord also thundered in the heavens. The highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. So maybe, and I'm just all over the map here, I realize it today, but maybe David is at the end of his running from Saul. For 10 years, he was exiled away from home, waiting to be anointed as king, and Saul was chasing him. 10 years. And maybe David is finally at this moment where he knows God is intervening, and maybe he's sitting in a rock in some dangerous place, and Saul's men have enclosed him in, and maybe God uses an earthquake and a storm and lightning, and maybe David is sitting in this cave and he's thinking, he's experiencing, watching all this happen through the darkness, lightning and thunder and some chaotic night. And maybe it's these events that finally drive away his enemies and really show David, God is here with me. And maybe in that cave, God just made his presence known to David and basically said to him, look at my power, watch what I do, watch my intervention. And maybe David is seeing all these things, and from his place of safety, journaling this, seeing and experiencing this cataclysmic intervention of God. Verse 15, then the channels of waters were seen. The foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke. So he's talking about some kind of fountain, some kind of river, some kind of floods that are flowing at the depths of the earth. Somehow he can see this. He can see God's power being revealed. O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. So he's just verse 15 describing God's breath, God's presence, God's providence and power. Nothing can stand in his way. Nothing stops him. Nothing keeps him from running to my aid and using all the forces of nature, if need be, to deliver me. Verse 16, he sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. Now I can say, in some ways figuratively, but in some ways literally, I can say God's done that in my life. He sent from above, he drew me out of things that were flooding over me in my life in uncontrollable ways I could not escape. And he drew me out of those waters. He took me, he drew me out of many waters. Verse 17, he delivered me from my strong enemy and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. So the big takeaway of verse 17, really verse 7 to 17, the big picture, it's almost like we're looking at a painting. And in verse 6, David is completely overwhelmed. He cannot get out of his circumstances. He's wrapped up by the cords of death. He's entombed. He's surrounded by people that hate him and they want him dead. And he's hopeless. And he's overpowered, okay? And he cries out. And verses 7 to 16, verse 7 to 15 is how God sweeps in with all the powers of the universe to bring to bear his deliverance on David's behalf. And we see so many things in this picture, but we see that when we are overwhelmed, when the forces against us are too strong for us, and we belong to God, that nothing can stand between God and his child. Nothing. No force in the universe can stand between God and his child. And we see that God cares about us so much that to accomplish his will in our lives, he will move heaven and earth. He will bring to bear the powers of all the forces of nature, if necessary, to protect, to deliver, to take us to where he wants us to be. Verse 17, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. You ever been to a place in life where you knew you were overwhelmed, overpowered, where you knew that you were done for, where you knew that you were just in way over your head? Well, I would imagine if you've been there, if you haven't, you probably will be before this life is over. But if you have, and you came through it with God, then you can look back and you can probably write a psalm like David wrote. You can describe all the supernatural events of providence that came to bear in your life. You can describe the way God moves circumstances beyond your power and beyond your control. And you can describe how he supernaturally intervened. We're reading here of God's supernatural intervention in David's life. I just don't want you to feel like this is just an Old Testament account of how God supernaturally intervened in someone's life and that he doesn't still do this today, because he very much does. If we see it, and if we're willing to acknowledge this is God's providence, this is God's hand, supernaturally sustaining, leading, directing, and he's very active in your life today, my friend. So maybe this is right in the middle of the storm for you, and you need to see the circumstances as God's intervention in your life in ways that maybe you won't understand for 10 years. Maybe this is preparatory for when the storm descends and the earth quakes around you, for you to realize, oh, maybe this is God doing something really, really wonderful. And maybe this is looking back for you. Maybe you can see, oh, yeah, I have been in a season or in a moment like David was, where I was overpowered by things too strong for me. And wow, oh, God did bring about cataclysmic events that reoriented me and reoriented my world. And in that way, he delivered me. Sometimes cataclysmic events are the answers to our prayers for deliverance. And that's how God works. Wow. If I told you how he's done this in my life, it would be too personal. And I don't think I should do that. I would just tell you he has. And he will do it in your life as well. Hey, we'll stop there at verse 17. I hope you'll meditate on these things today. Look at the supernatural events of your life. Look at the natural cataclysmic events of your life as supernatural. And know that God will deliver you. He may be in that very process right now. So don't doubt him. Call out to him. Cry out to him. Going back to verses 1 through 4, I will love thee, O Lord. I hope that will be your posture as God lets you watch what he does around you.